Welcome, I'm James Covey.
And this is Brandi Welterland, and you're listening to Shop Talk with Brandi and James.
Shop Talk is where we combine our shared experiences of living cross-culturally with our work as mental health professionals.
We have over 30 years combined experience living and working in parts of Europe, Central Asia, and Africa, and use this podcast to talk about what it means to live fully integrated and meaningful lives cross-culturally.
We hope that you find our conversations encouraging, educational, and maybe even a little fun, as we share through the lens of our training and experiences, and sometimes interview guests from around the world.
Thanks for listening.
Welcome back. We are continuing our three-part conversation on third culture kids, and we're excited to have a guest today. Tell us who we got, Brandi.
So today we have Dr. Joel Cagwin with us, and I'm really excited that we're going to get a chance to talk with him about his experience working with TCKs and also what he's learned from his research too. Dr. Cagwin has almost 20 years of practice as a therapist in community-based agencies, private practice, hospital work, and most recently, in an international boarding school and member care for international workers. He heads the counseling center at Black Forest Academy, working there since 2013. He also completed a PhD in counselor education and supervision, seeking to support the development of counselors working in an international setting. An expert in transitions for third culture kids, his research has emphasized transitioning during adolescence. Thanks so much for joining us today, Dr. Joel Cagwin. And I also get to work with Joel 2 days a week at Black Forest Academy, as he is the director of our department there. So it's a delight to be able to work with him and glean from his experience. Thanks for joining us today. And first off, I want to just ask you about, you finished your doctorate.
Yeah, it was about a year ago. I defended the dissertation, which is really kind of the last thing. I mean, there's a few edits after that, but defended the dissertation, I want to say beginning of May.
So what was both your degree and then what was your research specifically looking at?
Yeah, so I did a degree previously in clinical psychology, was the master's, and then I was practicing for quite some time. The PhD is counselor education and supervision. So it's a degree that's intended for people who already have been practicing. Usually they have a license at that point, they've got some experience, but they want to develop their skills in scholarship, like research. They want to develop their skills in being able to lead, vision for others, and teaching and training other people. So I had a friend of mine, somebody who I had done the master's with, who had done this program before, and she had been working in Thailand and had said before I headed to Germany, you might want to check out this program. I think it'd be really helpful for you. It'd be helpful for you working with other people, developing your ability to supervise and just understand scholarship, things like that. And so I checked it out. I hadn't really pictured becoming a doctor. After being here for about a year at Black Forest Academy, I saw that a lot of people who are practicing overseas tend to be pretty isolated. And I thought, you know what, this probably would be really good to get this kind of experience. Yeah.
So you chose to focus your research on TCKs, mostly like adolescent TCKs in transition.
Yeah.
Can you tell us why you chose that? Why you chose to go in that direction?
Yeah. Well, already I work with adolescent TCKs. In my work at Black Forest Academy. I had thought about this research. There's kind of a story. So that same person who's a friend of mine, she is a professor and had invited me to join her and one of my former professors at a conference doing online supervision, like demonstrating how you could do online supervision. So we used, a similar platform to Zoom. We used VC and that to kind of do this recorded live supervision. And she asked me to kind of create some, fictitious scenario that I would bring to her for supervision. And so I kind of like did this amalgamation of kind of a various issues I had seen in my practice here and suggested, okay, well, there's this family that's asked me to help them with their adolescent as they're preparing to go on home assignment, and he's really struggling connecting with students here at this school, but he's wondering what it's going to be like. How do you suggest that we help him make these transitions? So I brought this scenario to her, and she said, "Ooh, That's a really good one. That's a really common issue for third culture kids, and
Mhm.
especially in this kind of time frame. I made him out to be this fictitious student out to be a middle schooler, and she
Okay.
said, especially like 7th and 8th grade, that that's kind of known to be just such a hard time to make those transitions.
Right.
And that got me thinking, you know what? I think a good number of my students who I had been working with at BFA had been kind of dealing with that adjustment to returning to BFA after having been gone, kind of around those years. This is a number of years ago that I was thinking about that. And so I decided I'm going to try to do some research just on my own, just see what's out there. And I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find
Oh,
research.
interesting.
Yeah, I couldn't find
Yeah.
research on home assignments. And especially I couldn't find research about home assignment transitions during adolescence. What I did find is that there's a good amount of, especially dissertations, but there's some scholarly published articles that have to do with transitions after adolescence, well, late adolescence into young adulthood, that like 18 college age transition. There's a good amount of
like the adult TCK area.
The adult TCK
Yeah.
research is much more robust than looking at transition research during adolescence, especially for like missionary families. There's not a whole lot there about military families, but there's some in some of like the business diplomat world that has to do with adolescent transitions.
I was just going to point out, home assignment typically looks like, even for military families or those that are working overseas, typically try to go back to their home countries for a period. And that's kind of what you're referring to, if somebody didn't know what home assignment is.
Yeah, James, that's a good point. Yeah, I just kind of throw these terms out there, and we need to define those, right, for the people who might be listening to understand what it is. So a home assignment is what we used to call furlough. And people still will refer to it as a furlough. So it's a period of time when people who are assigned elsewhere overseas return to their home country. All these terms are a bit messy because even those terms, home country, carries with it this strangeness, especially for kids who that's never been their home. So a lot of families from the US or from Canada who've been working and serving somewhere in Europe, somewhere in Asia, somewhere in Africa, somewhere, anywhere else in the world, but they may expect for a period of time to return for a number of reasons to the US or to Canada. And I give US and Canada as an example, and that's where most of the research has come from. But people will return to other countries too. They'll return to other places in Asia, they'll return to other places in Africa. It happens all over the world, but the research tends to be more North American focused, which is common for a whole lot of research anyway.
Right. And I mean, for better or for worse, there are a lot of North American cross-cultural workers. So
there was one person who I got to interact with, who she had done some a dissertation, some research, and her research was really impressive. She had gotten thousands of responses in. She had asked a good number of questions, and sadly, it's only in dissertation form. She hasn't made it into scholarly articles in published journals. And I think some of her research would be really good to have out there in those kinds of settings. But anyway, her last name is Mace, and she did a bunch of third culture kid transition research. And one of the things that she found was that if people transition from one culture that's not a home culture to another culture, there's a good amount of stress that's there. But for the people who went back on home assignment and then returned to that same location, it suggests that there was more stress for them in her research than for people who were adjusting from one culture to another culture and then to a third culture.
Right. So like if your family's working, like you're from home culture A, your family's working in culture B, wherever, and if they transfer to culture C, then to culture D, that has a certain amount of stress associated with it. But if your family transitions back to home culture A for whatever period of time, then tries to go back to culture B, that carries with it generally more stress than the other.
That's what her research had suggested, and we were having a conversation about it, and that was a new phenomenon for her. She hadn't she was a third culture kid herself, a bit of a cross-cultural kid. She hadn't really interacted with the world of people who do these home assignments, these furlough experiences.
Okay.
So it was surprising to her to interact with that and then to discover. And her response was like, why are people doing that? And that's a good question. Like, are home assignments a good idea? And I am going to tell you, like, I'm not going to give you a yes or no answer to that.
No, I want a yes or no.
My research, the study I did, I had seen enough research that looked at, what was this hard or was this not hard, that I wanted to hear from the voices of people who have done this. So I did a narrative study where I interviewed 11, they were at that point young adults, reflecting on their experiences of transitioning through a home assignment when they were in adolescence.
Okay.
And there definitely were a good number of challenges in that, but there are also some benefits in that too. So there was some perspective taking. That's a benefit for the adolescents themselves. They got to be challenged in their perceptions of who they were and who people from their home culture were. I will say, I think it's pretty common for third culture kids to oftentimes have a little bit of a negative perspective about their home culture.
We talked about that a little bit last week too. That
Yeah,
I wonder if you were able to unpack that some with the kiddos that you talked with and interviewed.
The more experience they got to have with like real people, it helped them to kind of see, oh, okay, these are real people. And it didn't mean that they didn't have any criticism of the culture, but they got to at least experience interactions with people that they understood them better.
Okay.
That helped them in their transitions. If they had a good experience with that, that did seem to help them with their transitions into young adulthood, into the college age, which goes along with, there's a woman, Emily Hervey, who had done some research about it a decade ago. Her third culture kid research said that difficult transitions during adolescence seem to make adulthood transitions more challenging, especially during those college years, and that it persisted in being challenging throughout the college years. It didn't just kind of quickly wane after that. So harder transitions during childhood seem to make for harder transitions in adulthood.
But she's a TCK as well.
She is, yeah. I got to meet her briefly, I think, in that same conference that you and I met each other at, James.
Oh yeah, I worked with her in Kenya back in the day.
I was grateful for her research. I thought it was really well done and lent a good perspective. But that was the kind of research that I thought, okay, so we can see that there are some challenges with that. If we ask the stories of these kids, what do we find out? And what I found out tended to be that there was a whole lot of, as they entered into home assignment, just kind of viewing this as, this is going to be temporary. I just need to kind of get through this, get back overseas.
Just grit my teeth and just do this, right?
Yeah, and varying degrees of that, but that was a really common experience for these kids. Just kind of like, okay, so I'm going to get through this, but my real life is back overseas.
Right.
Some of these participants, the people who I got to interview, they were able to reflect on that and say, you know what, I don't think that was a helpful perspective. I think I needed to kind of invest better during the home assignment. And if I were to make a recommendation to kids and to parents who are anticipating a home assignment, I would say engage during your home assignment. Use it well. You will not regret that. People who don't engage tended to regret that they didn't engage better.
You were talking about when the perspective that they gain, how long it takes for them to make that connection when TCKs come back to the field after being on home assignment, how long it takes for them to make that connection of, maybe if I had engaged more, that would have been more helpful. If it takes a while, if there's still quite a bit of pain when they come back onto the field, they need to have some distance from that transition.
Yeah. I will say, I think that that's probably true, that a good number of people need some distance from it to be able to have that perspective. Some people were able to, like in the moment. Sometimes it took a relationship, like, oh, I built a good relationship with this person. This person actually hears me well. This person isn't so oblivious about my world.
Okay.
If I had done this well, I could have had a much better experience kind of throughout this process. That sometimes happens during the home assignment, but there are some people who they don't have those realizations until afterwards. So one of the other major themes that showed up in their transition experiences was when they got back overseas, it was a lot more challenging than they had anticipated. So they thought that they would slip right back into the relationship, but those relationships all shifted around. There's new people that re-entered into this community that I'm used to after I had left, and my friends have adjusted to my absence by engaging in other relationships. And I thought that they were just going to, roll out the red carpet and allow me to. Maybe that's a bit of an extreme perspective about it, but they thought, oftentimes subconsciously, that they would be able to slip right back into those relationships, and it's not so easy.
Right. They think it's going to be static while they're gone, but it's still this dynamic thing with, especially with TCK cultures, when there's new families coming in and out, and so new relationships form, and they start to develop things like their own inside jokes, their own stories. Someone comes back overseas from their time at home. It's like, well, I don't care what they're talking about. And
yeah,
you and I used to have lunch together every day. And
sounds like expectations are a huge part of that.
Yeah, and learning to manage those expectations is an important part of that. So learning how to anticipate what the home assignment is going to be like is an important part of that process. And I would say learning how to anticipate any of those transitions, the transition into young adulthood, is going to be important, to hold those expectations loosely, because I probably don't have an entirely realistic expectation of what it's actually going to look like. To be able to reflect on what my expectations are is a really important skill to have entering into those times of transition.
Right. Yeah. So you recently had a home assignment with your family, and I'm wondering how what you've learned through your research, how that interacted with your own experience with your kids. And they were, you have, during that time, you had some kids kind of in that sweet spot of middle school age, coming in and out of the country, and just how that looked for you, if you wouldn't mind sharing some of that.
Yeah, there's a way in which, so personally, this is separate from the research. Personally, it felt like it was a pretty sweet year to do it. Our ages, the ages of our kids were a little bit younger. We're not quite solidly into adolescence. And I'm not saying that it can't be harder for younger kids, but for our kids in the community that we entered into, it was a really forgiving experience in terms of just the challenges of getting into a new setting. We lived in a community of furlough homes. So everybody who is in these homes had also been living overseas and had returned for a year, just like we were doing. And so we would walk to school together. Parents would go walk together to pick up our kids and walk them back to our home. And for my son, who was in 6th grade at the time, he ate lunch with other 6th graders who were dealing with the same thing. It happened to also be because these furlough homes have been there for decades. The schools were used to kids coming in and out every year like this. And so they knew how to help our kids adjust from different educational settings and cultures as well. So it was a very forgiving setting. So it was, in some ways, we were so blessed. It was a challenge for our kids to just kind of deal with just the nervousness of entering into new relationships. When we first hopped into these furlough homes, our kids were buried in their books. It's great for our kids to read, but we eventually had to say, you're putting the books away. Go. There's kids who are outside interacting with each other. Now's the time to kind of meet them. And they did. They formed great relationships, but that nervousness, that shyness in the beginning was real. That was hard for them to just deal with that early on. And I'm grateful, and they're grateful for the relationships that they developed, and they have kept in touch with some of those friends too. It's been a really sweet thing to be able to watch as a parent. Coming back afterwards, I would also say, it had its bumps, but I think for the most part, it was a pretty forgiving experience coming back too. If it had happened a few years later for our kids, I wonder, would it have been harder? Would those classes have been bigger, and would it have been harder for them to just feel like they could enter right back into those relationships? Our experience was really sweet and really hard. It was both. Our kids do have a better sense for what our hometown is like. And we had talked as a family about, we now have multiple homes. We have a home here in Germany, and we have a home in Illinois. And I think our kids have a sense of that. Of course, that fades, I think, over time, that sense of connection to that place as time has passed. But they have a picture in their mind of what it's like.
I'm just curious, like, what are some of those practical elements that after your research, you're like, actually, here are some helpful things that families can do to navigate the kind of to the passport country and back relationships.
I would suggest for parents to read the Third Culture Kids book by Pollock and Van Recken. I think that that's just a really key thing to understand what a third culture kid is. And they speak well about transitions, and they give good hints, good suggestions for how to deal with those transitions, how to do good goodbyes, and some of the challenges and some of the strengths. So I would strongly recommend, if you can get that book, if you can read that and understand, I think that's really, really important.
Okay.
In the research that I did with adolescents, I think it's important for parents to understand that you are going to be very important, but you're going to be very important as a support for your kids. If they're adolescents, their sense of belonging, they're deriving so much from their interactions with their peers. So they will get some sense of belonging with you, but if you can help them reinforce and help support them to build good relationships with their peers, don't make play dates for them, probably in adolescence, but if you can help them to know how to navigate, to develop the skills to do so, that could be really, really important. Just be aware as a parent that their sense of belonging is going to be less tied to you than it is going to be tied to how they're connecting well with their peers.
Okay.
So, but the support that they get from you, they notice. So if their support is going well, they will recognize it, and for the most part, they're going to be grateful for that.
Even if that gratefulness is not verbalized.
Even if that gratefulness is not verbal, they may tell their therapist, but they won't tell you.
But it's like, as they transition from needing you more to peers being more important, you're still like home base for them. And so they want to know they have a solid base they can go and just touch or look at and make eye contact with, and know that you see them, that you're supporting them. And they may be pulling away, but they still want to look back and see, like, make sure mom and dad have got them too. For
the people who I researched in this study who did not sense that strong base, that absence of that strong base really stood out when they experienced their parents as preoccupied, as absent, as their own stuff kind of getting in the way. That really stood out for these kids, and made it hard for them to kind of not feel preoccupied themselves, just with like how, what support base do I have? And sometimes that realization of how big of a deal it was also comes over time. They may not realize how hurtful it was. They may be living it out, but not realize it until later on, a few years down the road. So they'll be grateful for it when it's there. And I would say, like, my participants, they recognize their parents. They could see their parents' strengths. But there were some that hurt of the absence of a good bond with their parents that was really felt, especially during those times of transition. So a good attachment with a parent is really, really important. And so, James, back to your question about a practical thing, I would say for parents, pay attention to your own experience, your own emotions about what it means to be in the US, your own emotions about what it means to be with my family of origin, and to be back in these settings where I may not have been for years, because your perspective about this stuff and your own emotional life about this stuff is really important. If there's marital stuff, try to address that as well. So do your own work. If you're in the US, it's a great time to find a therapist. If you've got a 6-month-long home assignment, it's a great time to see somebody and do your own work. Even if you think, I'm doing pretty well, it's a great time to get some good work done.
Sure.
And I think it's helpful for your kids to see that you're working on this stuff, because it gives them permission to work on their own things.
I wonder if this is something that's come up for you, Joel, that the transitions for the parents and their kids their experiences can be so different, and that it's helpful for the parents to realize that their kids are going to have a different experience of transition and different experience of the home culture than they do. And I wonder if that's something that's come up for you as well.
I think that it's probably likely that the experience of home assignment is going to be different for parents and for adolescents. I would say that probably varies to a degree, as I think about the people who I got to interview, how aware their parents were about that difference. Parents who were really intentional about getting dedicated time, and it didn't even necessarily have to be a ton of time, but paying attention to those times of transition, seemed to have a better sense of what their kids were going through. There was one young man who told me about how his father would have to go on some business trips, and this would happen during home assignment. This would happen when he was living overseas. But before each of his transition times, he would go on a walk. They would go on a walk together, and his father would always ask, I think, 3 or 4 questions. It was always kind of the same questions. And that meant so much to the son to kind of have this dedicated time to connect. So even when the father had to go away for, days or weeks, the son noticed that the father knew what was going on in his life, because he was really deliberately asking about it. I think about my own experience as a parent, and I know that my experience was different than my kids. I really had a lovely experience in the community where we were. I was grateful for developing the new relationships that I did have. I knew to be intentional about those relationships from previous experiences in life, and also even just thinking about this research about building those relationships. And I encouraged our kids to be intentional about it too. But I could see how that was hard for them. There were times that they were really nervous. They were really shy and anxious about what it's going to be to start up this new conversation with people I've never met before. So I could see that it was different as a parent, and I did my best to kind of understand from their perspective. I'm curious even now. I've spent so much time interviewing other people, and I've asked my kids already, but it's been a couple years. If we were to talk about it now, how would they reflect on it differently now after they've had some time to look back, and they've had a couple years of maturity to gain in reflecting on those times? I'm curious.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
I was going to say, it's hard. There will always be challenges to uprooting your family, going to raise them in a different country or multiple countries, and then going back and forth. If it was easy, more people would do it. I think part of what we're talking about is how do you navigate successfully as possible the challenges that just exist with having your kids, your family go through that much transition and that much significant transition. Like, it's okay that it's hard. And I want parents to give themselves grace to not listen to this and be like, oh no, we have messed them up so bad because I didn't do a check-in every time, I left for a trip.
Right.
And there's just not a playbook for everybody, because every kid is so different. Even within the context of one family, each kid is going to respond completely differently to transition to new places because they're in different grades, different friends. And so I just want to encourage families, hey, there are challenges about transition, but there's also some beautiful things about raising third culture kids who have this amazing global experience, and some of the bumps are worth it. And the call you have is worth it. And it's important to evaluate that.
Yeah.
There's so much value in being able to go to your kids and say, I'm really sorry. I realize we did it this way, and I think it would have been better to do it this way. And then that helps so much for kids to be able to hear that from you, and for you to own your own process as you're learning how to do it too. So there is, like, even if you look back and you're like, I can't believe I handled it that way, there's opportunity to grow in your relationship with your kids from that too.
Yeah.
So when we left Central Asia in 2011, we practiced this RAFT way of saying goodbye to a place and transitioning. And RAFT stands for reconciliation, affirmation, farewell, and thinking ahead, thinking forward. And so we did that with our kids. But we thought, or I guess I thought, we've done this RAFT. It's such a beautiful RAFT. We crafted this wonderful way of saying goodbye and looking ahead. And okay, we did it. Well done. Our kids were still transitioning though. And we got to the States, and it was hard for them. They missed Central Asia. They weren't sure what to expect in Germany. But I thought, we built our RAFT. I thought we built our RAFT. So why is it still hard? The thing is, it's still hard.
Yeah, you did the thing.
Yeah, we did the thing. But that's to say, like, yes, you can incorporate these great transition techniques and practices and your kids can still hurt and it can still be hard for them, and that's okay too.
Yeah.
And also to just be aware that just because you implement these practices does not safeguard or protect your kids from the pain of transition. They could still have a hard time. They're good practices, but also realize in real life too, your kids might still struggle.
Yeah.
I'd love to get your thoughts on just what you think is a good kind of rotation, because once upon a time, people that went overseas would go for 4 or 5 years. And because of the challenges of travel, the cost, it tended to be, you're gone for 4 years, you go back to your home country for a year. And, that gives a lot of kids maybe 1 or 2 times back in their home culture before they kind of launch, whatever that looks like. What are your thoughts? Like, what is a good plan now in today's modern age to balance and to plan for those kinds of transitions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I know that there have been people for decades who have had different recommendations about what would be the kind of ideal. I've heard of some families saying, hey, we want to make sure that each of our kids has one transition during adolescence before adulthood to kind of prepare them. Some people don't want any transitions during adolescence. And so there's a variety of perspectives. Just like I did before, I'm not going to give you a definite, like, this is the best one.
But you're the doctor.
Yeah, right?
Esteemed Dr. Joel Cagwin.
I think whether it happens in a 3-year, 1-year break, if it's a 4-year, 6-month break, it's there's a lot of different styles that it could happen, but I would say whether it's 6 months or 1 year, I think what's a bigger deal is how well do you engage while you're on the home assignment. There's a guy who, decades ago started doing research on kind of acculturative stress and started to look at how well people are doing in a number of spheres, including psychologically, depending on how well they're engaged in their culture of heritage and the culture that they've moved to. And his name is Barry. He's got tons of people who've used his research. And
is that his first name or is that his last name?
Barry is his last name with an
Okay.
E-R-R-Y. What he found was that people who are engaged well in both, who maintain engagement both in heritage setting and host setting, place that they've moved to, they are people who do better on psychological scores across the board. People who stay engaged better in their heritage setting may score better in some psychological areas, but not across the board. So people who are able to stay engaged in both settings are able to do well. Organizations have different reasons for having a home assignment at different stages. And we live in Germany with the kinds of visas and the expectations with Social Security. We're supposed to be here for 5 years and then leave for 366 days before we come back. That's the arrangement that the US and Germany have. And so there's lots of reasons why these home assignments happen. And it's not just a family decision for schooling or for exposure to the culture, but if it's happening, engagement in both settings is really, really important. It helps prepare people well. It helps them learn more about themselves. And it actually does help their psychological functioning better long-term for people who are dealing with those kinds of transitions.
Do you have some ideas for what that kind of engagement could be?
Yeah, I think about even with my own kids, and I got to witness the kind of, nervousness, the shyness, the anxiety that they had. And I would say that one part of dealing with that engagement is learning how to kind of regulate our anxiety when we're dealing with new social situations.
Okay.
So how do we know that how can we feel okay when we have to deal with these new novel situations that are oftentimes so anxiety producing? So that's an important part. Like, how do we manage our emotions? Engagement also is just how do we reach out? How do we be present? I think about like the attachment model of relationships and how attachment looks at accessibility, responsiveness, and engagement. So those 3 areas, I think if we go to a new place and we make ourselves available, accessible to the people that we're starting a new relationship with. We do so by learning how to ask good questions of people, by showing interest in themselves. The truth is, a lot of third culture kids are really, really good about asking questions. It doesn't mean that they automatically are. But if we can kind of lean on some of those TCK strengths, but you use them in the home culture, we pay attention to what's going on. We're responsive to the people who are around us, kind of showing interest, being a learner. Yeah, being somebody who's open to learning about this culture that you may have had a sense that I know what it's about, but that probably means for parents too, that we need to learn how to engage and ask good questions while we're there. Don't rely on our understanding of this place from 5-6 years ago. Hey, we've been gone for 5 years. You know, the news makes it seem really different than it was when I last lived here. What's it like for you to live here? And what do I need to learn about this?
I often encourage families to use the same principles and strategies that they used when they went overseas for the first time.
Yeah.
All the aspects of cross-cultural learning that they probably went through some training on, you know, observation. And that's what I tell kids to do. When you go back to your home country, look around, what are the teens doing?
Yeah.
And then don't do any of it. No, I'm kidding.
I wonder if you have any ideas about with TCKs and their, you know, the parents are needing to talk to various supporters and churches and things like that. In your research, if you've heard anything from the TCKs you talked to about what that experience has been like for them, like if they've had to, you know, get up in front of churches, if it feels like a dog and pony show for them sometimes, or can you say whatever in a different language, or can you tell us the funniest story you've ever heard? And just if you've kind of picked up on anything that might be helpful.
I would say I did hear some of that kind of like eye rolling, like, oh, that's what they think that my life is. You know, see you in the, you know, church foyer and ask those questions like, hey, can you say something in that language? I did experience a little bit of that eye rolling in some of the interviews that I had with people. So they that while there was eye rolling, it wasn't like it didn't stand out as this major issue that was greatly offensive, but there was sometimes a sense of like they were wary of racism and ethnocentricity when they were back in the US, and would say honestly that there was a good amount of racism, ethnocentricity that they experienced. I can remember one person talking about a teacher that she had that had made some pretty broad statements about Muslims that she found offensive, and when she reported them to me, I said, yeah, that sounds pretty offensive. It's not that you aren't going to run into those issues when you return to the US, that it's only going to be a positive experience, but figuring out like, how do I engage even if I find that the people are being offensive about the people who I care about overseas. And figuring out how to manage that is important. I think it's an important thing for parents to be able to talk about with their kids. Like, how do you navigate when you see ethnocentricity and racism and things like that? So yeah.
Right. Or people, you know, with good intentions are trying to boil your experience down into tell me your funniest story and say something cool in a different language, when your experience is so much richer than that too.
Yeah.
But it sounds like a lot of what you're saying is proactive involvement from parents is really important, and just engagement and being available.
Yeah, the support that's there is going to be really important. Now, when I say support, it doesn't mean that you are talking to them that they're going to be able to tell you all their experiences. They might want to kind of like keep you a little bit at bay, like, let me have some space.
You mean what you're saying, there's something new here. The adolescents want their space from their parents?
Want space from parents. I don't know if that's novel, if that's just brand new.
I just got to sit with that for a bit. Okay, right.
But your support's really, really important. But who they really want to talk to in terms of finding their belonging is their peers. And they're going to be hurting if they don't experience that. They might kind of dismiss people in the US in terms of a good belonging option, but if you can encourage them that it's not necessarily a bad option, and they learn how to engage better, they're probably going to have a better experience. Also, yeah, parents being engaged, being aware that the return overseas is probably not going to go as smoothly as you suspect either. That those relationships, for everybody returning back overseas, oftentimes is a little bit bumpy. It may not be bumpy for very, very long, but it can be surprising. It can be even shocking how those bumps happen when people return back overseas.
Right.
So much is about belonging. So like teens especially, well, their sense of belonging was where they were living for the longest time. So to go back and find that sense of belonging is not the same is hard.
Well, belonging is in relationship, and the relationship isn't as reciprocal as I thought that it was going to be, or isn't as engaged with me as I thought it was going to be.
Or that person's moved while I was gone.
Yeah.
Which happens a lot.
Yeah.
So that's hard. I've seen a lot of families find success in that engagement across cultures by having people come visit and kind of doing extra work to help maintain some of those relationships, like friends from their home country, the kids come and spend a month in the summertime. And then the reverse happens with friends from school coming to the States and trying to do things so that there's somebody that knows a little bit of what their experience is like. Even families, grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, those who can get just a little bit of, hey, I have seen where you live and know your life, is so helpful to help make that kind of transition. Just somebody that kind of knows the experience. Yeah. Same for adults too, just to have somebody like, remember when you were at my house, you have seen it. It's just helpful.
I want to thank you so much for joining us and for talking about, like, just listening to you talk about it and listening to how intentionally you and Kristen moved towards your kids and more so aware of your kids and y'all's transitions. It's great to listen to, and it's great to listen to what you've learned through your research too. So I appreciate it. I appreciate what you've shared with us today.
Thanks, Brandi. Thanks, James.
Can we link your dissertation?
Yeah, you can link my dissertation. Yeah, I made it public.
Okay.
I did what I could to I want it to be accessible to people. If you look at my dissertation, starting towards the last 30 pages of the dissertation is an abridged version of it. It's only 30 pages as opposed to 270 pages.
Well, that just ruined my desire for a PhD.
I know, right? Oh man. I'm going to recommend, like we've talked about this before, I think when we talked to Ted about grief, I'm going to recommend the movie Inside Out, because I think it's such a good picture of transition and being fully integrated, fully aware of your emotions and how important they are during transition. If you're a TCK, try to recognize yourself in it. If you're a parent, look at it, try to look at it through your child's eyes too.
Another couple books, Lauren Wells has written a few books related to third culture kids. She has a new one called The Tower of Grief, a practical guide to processing grief with third culture kids. So I definitely recommend that one. It's new and available on Kindle. Well, thanks so much for being here. Stay tuned next time as we have episode 3 on TCKs.
Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Joel. Because I got stuck again.